My sister walked away with $5.7 million and a mansion gleaming with marble floors and chandeliers. And me, I was left with a broken shack in the woods, a cruel insult that cut deeper than any words my parents had ever spoken. For 32 years, I tried to prove I was worth more than scraps, but when the will was read, it was like they slapped me one last time. I gripped those cabin keys so hard my knuckles turned white, and I swore I would burn that rotten place to ashes. I drove through the snow, gasoline cans rattling in the back, ready to watch flames erase every reminder of my humiliation. But when I opened that cabin door, cold air in my lungs and rage in my chest, I froze. On the fireplace sat an envelope with my name in my father's shaky handwriting. Inside a secret waited a secret he never dared to tell while alive. That night my life turned upside down. What I found didn't just change the inheritance. It changed everything I thought I knew about myself, my sister, and my father's legacy. You think 5.7 million is the greater prize, or could the truth buried in the woods be worth far more? Stay with me. Because what I uncovered will make you question what real inheritance truly means. So tell me, if you were left with nothing but a broken cabin, would you burn it down or open the letter waiting in the dark? My name is Daniel Holt. I'm 32 years old, a carpenter by trade, a man who finds peace in working with his hands. While my sister Mira made her life out of marble floors and polished speeches, I spent mine repairing chairs and building decks for neighbors who couldn't afford much. I never minded the simplicity, but I always believed naively that when the time came, my parents would see me as more than the family's forgotten son. The day of the will reading began with polished shoes squeaking on marble floors and the scent of leather-bound books lingering in the law office. Mira arrived first, draped in a designer coat, her diamonds catching the winter light as if she were already the queen of an empire. She carried herself like someone who knew the outcome. Before the first word was spoken, her smile smooth but sharp enough to cut. I sat opposite her in a plain jacket, my hands rough with calluses, trying not to notice how out of place I looked in that room. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the folder, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. The estate of Richard and Alma Holt. His voice was steady, but when his eyes landed on me, I saw hesitation flicker. He began with Mira's share. To our beloved daughter, Mira Holt, we leave the Los Angeles estate valued at $5.7 million, along with all investments, jewelry, and associated holdings. The words echoed in the room like a gavel striking down. Mira crossed her legs, delicately nodding as if this were no surprise at all. Her lips curved into a polished smile, and without looking at me, she whispered, "Of course." I waited. Surely there had to be something else. Stocks, a car, a bank account left for me. Anything. The lawyer hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might close the folder and simply walk away. His tone softened. To our son Daniel Holt, we leave the cabin in Montana. The silence that followed was deafening. My chest tightened as though the very air had turned against me. A cabin, an old decaying shack I had not seen in years. That was it, after decades of being their son, after nights spent fixing their broken fences, after holidays, where I sat in the shadows while Mira basked in praise. My parents had left me nothing but a moldy shack in the woods. Mira turned her gaze to me, her eyes glinting with triumph. "You always liked the woods, didn't you, Daniel?" Her words dripped with cruelty, thinly veiled as kindness. The way she said it, as if my life in the dirt and sawdust had been some sort of joke. I gripped the arms of the leather chair so tightly the wood creaked under my hands. Every memory of being overlooked rushed back. My treehouse project brushed aside my carpentry, dismissed as a phase, every polite nod from my parents when I tried to show them something I built. Always second place, always invisible. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between us. Even he seemed to understand the cruelty in the division. But he was bound by words on paper, and so he closed the folder with a quiet finality. Mira gathered her coat around her shoulders, the sound of her heels striking the floor echoing in the hall as she left, humming softly like she had already forgotten me. Her inheritance sparkled around her neck. Mine reeked of mildew and disappointment. I sat there long after she was gone, staring at the folder that had changed everything. My parents in death had sent me the same message they had in life: Mira mattered, I did not. The insult burned hotter than any flame I could conjure. If they wanted me to have the cabin, I would have it on my own term, not as a shrine to their neglect, but as ashes in the wind. By the time I left the law office, I had already made up my mind. My jaw clenched, my fists tight in my pockets. I whispered the vow under my breath, not caring who heard. If all I'm worth is a shack, then I'll turn it to ashes. And with that, I walked into the cold Los Angeles night, already planning the fire that would erase their final insult. The city lights faded quickly behind me as I steered north, my truck cutting through the darkness like a wounded animal trying to outrun the pain. Los Angeles was miles away now, and all I carried with me was the bitterness that burned hotter than the heater blowing in my cab. The storm grew worse with each passing hour, snow slashing across the windshield wipers, groaning under the weight. But I didn't slow down. Every mile brought me closer to that cabin, closer to the fire I had promised myself I would set. The road was long and empty, but my thoughts were louder than the wind. I remembered the countless nights as a boy when my parents praised Mira's perfect grades, her glittering friends, her polished charm. I remembered standing in the corner clutching some small wooden thing I had built with my hands, waiting for their eyes to turn toward me. They rarely did. Even as a child, I felt like a shadow in my own home. The cabin in Montana had been my only escape. A place where I wasn't compared or measured, where I could breathe. But now, knowing it was all they thought I deserved, it had transformed into a symbol of every insult I had ever swallowed. The heater rattled in the truck, but my hands stayed cold. My knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as images filled my mind: Mira lounging in her marble palace, raising a glass of wine, laughing at the thought of her brother inheriting nothing but rot and mildew. The thought fanned the flames inside me. I wasn't just driving to Montana, I was driving toward revenge. In the passenger seat lay the box of matches, small and ordinary but filled with promise. In the bed of the truck, the two gasoline cans clanked against each other with every bump in the frozen road. Their sound was steady, almost like a drumbeat, keeping time with my rage. I didn't bring them as some empty gesture. I intended to use them. I could already see the flames licking the walls, tearing down the roof, devouring the shame my parents had handed me. Snow piled high on the roadside as I pushed on through the night. At one point, I had to stop scraping the ice from my windshield, my breath turning white in the air. As I scraped, I looked up into the sky. The stars were hidden behind thick gray clouds, and I felt as though even heaven had turned its back on me. I muttered under my breath, "If this is what I was worth, then let it burn." By the time I crossed into Montana, the storm had eased, but the cold was sharper, more punishing. The roads narrowed and the trees loomed taller, branches heavy with snow that bent under their own weight. The silence here was different from the city. It pressed against me, heavy and expectant, as though the land itself was waiting to see if I would follow through with my vow. When the cabin finally came into view, I almost didn't recognize it. The roof sagged like a tired old man, the shutters banged against the windows, each slam echoing through the night. The porch tilted dangerously to one side and the walls bore streaks of rot. Once this had been my refuge, now it was nothing but a cruel reminder of where I stood and my family forgotten, unwanted, cast aside. I pulled the truck up in front, the tires crunching over snow and ice. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat for a moment staring at the place I once loved. Memories flickered uninvited, running through the woods with a fishing pole too big for my hands, sitting by the fire as my mother hummed softly, splitting logs with my father's proud eyes watching. For a fleeting second, I almost felt the warmth of those days. But then the reality struck again. If those moments had truly meant something to them, why leave me this wreck while Mira inherited millions? The answer was clear. I wasn't enough. I never had been. Anger surged back with full force. I shoved the truck door open and stepped out. Boots sinking into the snow. The cold bit at my face, but I hardly felt it. I yanked one gasoline can from the bed, the handle biting into my palm, and carried it up the creaking steps of the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight as if protesting the act I was about to commit. I set the can down by the door, staring at the cabin with a gaze that burned hotter than any flame I could conjure. The matches in my pocket felt heavy, almost alive, like they were begging to be struck. My jaw tightened as I whispered to the night, "Tonight this insult ends." I reached for the door handle, ready to step inside and soak the walls in gasoline. But as the door cracked open with a groan, a draft of icy air swept past me, carrying with it something unexpected. My eyes landed on the fireplace inside, and what I saw there made me pause. A cabin door groaned as it opened, spilling a gust of frigid air into my face. I stepped across the threshold, boots crunching against the warped wooden floor. The air inside was colder than outside, thick with the scent of damp rot. Shadows clung to the corners, cobwebs draped over abandoned furniture. This place was nothing but decay, and I had come prepared to finish the job. I pulled the gasoline can up onto the floor and unscrewed the cap. The sharp scent of fuel filled the air, mingling with the stench of mildew. I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar weight of the matchbox, rough cardboard edges pressing into my palm. This was it, the moment I had been driving toward through miles of storm and anger. I bent down, ready to splash gasoline across the floorboards, when a sudden gust of wind forced its way through the cracked window. The draft rattled the shutters and carried something loose from the mantel. An envelope fluttered to the ground, landing near my boots. My heart gave a startled jolt. I straightened the gasoline can still in my grip and stared. The envelope was yellowed with age, its edges curled, but the handwriting across the front was unmistakable. My father's, to Daniel. The sight of my name written in the shaky, uneven script I had seen on birthday cards and half-scribbled notes froze me where I stood. For years I had believed he barely thought of me at all, and yet here was proof he had left something behind. Not for Mira, not for the family, but for me alone. My first instinct was suspicion. Perhaps it was another insult, directions on how to fix a leaky roof, or a reminder to chop firewood, some final dig at the son who never measured up. My pulse pounded in my ears as I bent down and picked it up. The paper felt fragile, but the weight of it in my hands was heavier than stone. I set the gasoline can aside and carefully opened the flap. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, the ink faded but legible. My eyes scanned the words, each one striking me harder than the last. My son Daniel, I know you are angry. I know you feel forgotten, but you were never forgotten. You were meant for something different. Mira belongs to the world of wealth and society. You belong here with the land. Your true inheritance lies in the woods. Follow the path behind the cabin. Half a mile in, you will find an oak tree with a scar in its bark. Beneath it rests what is yours and yours alone. I sank onto a dusty chair by the fireplace, the paper trembling in my hands. The words blurred as moisture filled my eyes, though whether from anger or something else I couldn't tell. I read them again, slower this time, letting each phrase sink in. Never forgotten. Yours alone. True inheritance. The matchbox sat heavy in my pocket, but the urge to strike a flame was gone, replaced by a swirl of confusion and reluctant hope. My father, who had left me nothing but this crumbling shack, claimed he had hidden something more. For the first time in years, I felt like a thread had been handed to me in the darkness, a lifeline begging me to follow. And yet doubt gnawed at me. What if it was another trick, another way to remind me I would never be enough? What if all I found was disappointment buried under snow and earth? The humiliation would cut deeper than ever. Still, I could not ignore it. The man who had denied me approval in life had left behind words that suggested he saw me. Truly saw me. My hands shook as I folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. I looked at the gasoline can by the door, the matchbox in my pocket, the broken cabin surrounding me. None of it made sense anymore. The fire I had promised to set now seemed meaningless. The real flames were already inside me, lit by curiosity and a hunger I had tried for years to smother. I stood my chair, scraping against the floor. My father's words echoed in my head, louder than the storm outside. Your true inheritance lies in the woods. I tightened my coat around me and glanced toward the back door. Beyond it, the snow-covered forest stretched into darkness, silent and foreboding. For the first time that night, I felt something stronger than rage. I felt called. I snatched up a lantern from the corner, brushed away the cobwebs, and struck a match to its wick. The soft glow spilled across the room, casting the cabin in a new light. My gaze fell on the path that led out the back, barely visible through the frosted glass. My father's voice seemed to whisper from the letter still clutched in my hand. Half a mile in, the scarred oak, the gasoline cans stood where I had left them, silent witnesses to the decision I had abandoned. My revenge was no longer fire. My revenge would be to uncover what my father had hidden from Mira, from the world, perhaps even from himself. I stepped to the back door, lantern in hand, my breath fogging in the cold air. I pulled the door open, the night swallowing me whole. The snow stretched out before me, untouched, waiting. And somewhere out there beneath a scarred oak tree lay the truth. The cabin door closed behind me with a hollow thud, and the night swallowed me whole. The lantern's weak glow pushed against the dark, but the forest seemed endless, a sea of white stretching beyond the trees. Each breath cut sharp in my throat, icy crystals forming at the edges of my beard. My boots sank deep into the snow, and the crunch of each step was the only proof I was moving forward. In one hand I carried the lantern, in the other a shovel I had dragged from the shed. My father's words echoed with every step, half a mile in the scarred oak. The cold was merciless. The wind whipped through the branches, scattering snow that stung my face like needles. My coat, heavy as it was, could not keep out the chill burrowing into my bones. I pulled it tighter, head bent low against the gusts. The lantern flame wavered, threatening to die out with every blast of air. But I shielded it with my hand, unwilling to be left blind in the storm. Each step seemed to stretch the distance further. Half a mile felt like 10. The forest pressed in around me, tall pines bowing under the weight of snow. I thought about turning back more than once, retreating to the cabin, where the gasoline waited, where fire could erase the humiliation instead of this freezing march. But my father's handwriting burned in my memory. Your true inheritance lies in the woods. The words were both a taunt and a promise, and I could not let them go. The snow grew deeper as I followed the faint suggestion of a path. My legs ached, muscles screaming with effort. My breath puffed in harsh clouds, each exhale stolen away by the wind. Somewhere above a tree groaned under the strain of ice, the sound like a warning. I clenched the shovel tighter as though the weight of it could steady me. Then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind howling through the trees. But as I trudged further, I swore I heard my father's voice, low and insistent, threading through the gusts. "Daniel, keep going." I shook my head, anger rising with the cold. He had ignored me in life. Why should he speak to me now? But the whispers persisted, woven into the storm, until I could no longer tell if they were memory madness or something else entirely. I thought of Mira then, warm in her marble halls, sipping wine while I stumbled through snow and ice. The unfairness of it burned hotter than the lantern in my hand. She had millions and I had this misery frostbite and the promise of something hidden in the ground. My jaw tightened, rage pushing me forward. If this was another insult, I would dig it up, throw it in the fire and watch it burn. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. My body screamed for rest, but the thought of surrender was worse. Each crunch of snow carried me deeper, the trees looming like silent judges. Then through the blur of snowflakes I saw it. A great oak wider than any around its bark, marred by a long, jagged scar. The wound cut across its surface like a memory that refused to heal. I stopped, chest-heaving, breath billowing in thick clouds. My lantern's glow danced across the tree's scar and my pulse quickened. This was it. The place my father had sent me, the place he had buried something just for me. The shovel weighed heavy in my hand, more burden than tool, but it was the key to what lay beneath. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the oak as the wind roared louder, almost daring me to begin. My hands trembled from cold and from what I knew I was about to uncover. The scarred tree towered above me, silent, waiting. I lifted the shovel and drove it into the frozen ground. The shovel struck the frozen ground with a hollow clang, sending vibrations up my arms. Each blow rattled my bones, but I refused to stop. The earth was locked in ice, stubborn and unyielding. But so was I. My breath poured from me in ragged clouds, my shoulders burning with every motion. The lantern's glow quivered beside me, throwing long shadows across the scarred oak. I dug as though the truth itself depended on the strength of my arms. Maybe it did. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My gloves grew damp with sweat despite the bitter cold, and my muscles screamed for rest. The frozen dirt fought me with every strike, but gradually the ground began to give way. A thin layer of thawed earth broke free and the shovel bit deeper. I gritted my teeth and drove it down again, then again, until the sound changed. Not the dull scrape of soil, but the metallic clang of something buried beneath. My heart leapt into my throat. I dropped to my knees, clawing at the loosened dirt with my hands, fingers stinging from the cold. Slowly the edges of a box emerged, iron-bound and heavy, its surface crusted with rust. It was a chest larger than I expected, wedged tight against the roots. My pulse pounded as I cleared the soil away, exposing its full shape. At that moment I thought of gold coins, cash sealed against time, or perhaps jewelry my father had hidden away. A fortune secreted under the forest floor, proof that he had trusted me more than anyone else. For one breathless instant I believed I had struck wealth beyond Mira's mansion and millions. With a groan of effort I hooked my hands under the chest and heaved. It resisted at first, but inch by inch I freed it from the earth until it lay before me in the snow. My arms shook, my lungs burned, but I hardly noticed. All I could see was the chest locked and waiting. I fumbled with the latch fingers, stiff from cold, and finally pried it open. The lid creaked, hinges groaning like a voice long since. Lantern light spilled across the contents and my heart sank. Inside were no stacks of bills, no glittering gold. Instead, bundles of paper lay wrapped in oilcloth edges, frayed ink fading with age. Old journals, ledgers, scraps of maps. For a moment, disappointment crashed over me so hard it almost drove me back. My laugh came out harsh and bitter, lost to the wind after all the struggle, all the humiliation. My father had left me a box of paper. Was this another cruel joke hidden beneath the snow? I grabbed one bundle, tore at the oilcloth, and unrolled a brittle sheet. Maps sprawled across the page, hand-drawn lines marking ridges, streams, and boundaries. At first, they made no sense, just wilderness sketched in careful detail. Then I saw it, notations along the edges, parcel numbers, signatures. My eyes widened as I traced the ink. These weren't simple drawings, they were property maps. I reached deeper into the chest and pulled free a heavier packet. Inside were legal documents, yellowed but official, stamped with seals. And there in bold letters across the deed was my name, Daniel Holt. My hands shook as I held it to the lantern light, forcing my eyes to focus. The land wasn't just drawn, it was mine. Thousands of acres surrounding the cabin, purchased piece by piece, hidden away until this moment. My breath caught in my chest. The cabin had been an insult, a broken shell tossed to me like scraps while Mira basked in luxury. But this was something greater, vast and enduring, worth far more than marble floors and chandeliers. It wasn't money to spend, but land to keep. Legacy, not scraps. I sat back in the snow, the chest yawning open at my feet, the documents spread across my lap. The cold bit through my coat, but I barely felt it. My father's voice seemed to whisper again through the trees, not taunting this time, but steady, almost proud. For the first time I began to understand. Still questions swirled. Why had he hidden it? Why leave Mira the obvious wealth and bury this for me? Was it trust or another test I didn't yet see? The mystery pressed heavier than the chest itself. I looked down at the papers, my name staring back from the deed, undeniable and final. My humiliation had cracked, letting something new slip through. Not relief, not yet. But the first flicker of power. And in that frozen clearing beneath the scarred oak, I realized this was only the beginning. Snow still clung to my coat as I dragged the chest into the cabin and set it before the cold fireplace. The lantern's glow flickered across the iron band's shadows, stretching long across the walls. My fingers trembled as I reached inside once more, pulling out a leather-bound journal. Its cover cracked and worn. The spine creaked as I opened it, releasing the faint scent of dust and time. The first page bore my father's familiar handwriting, steadier than the letter, but still his. I skimmed the lines and my breath caught. He had begun the journal decades ago, back when I was just a boy. I have begun to purchase parcels of land around the cabin, quietly, piece by piece, without drawing attention. The others would not understand. They see wilderness as waste, but I see the future in it. This place must remain whole, untouched. I turned the page, heart thudding. Entry after entry described negotiations, small purchases, sometimes only a few acres at a time. He wrote about holding meetings in dusty courthouses, convincing reluctant neighbors to sell, and slowly stitching together thousands of acres into one great expanse. Another entry pulled me back into childhood. Daniel spends hours in the woods, disappearing into the trees with nothing but a fishing pole or his hands. He is never happier than when he is here. I know he is different from Mira, but different does not mean less. He belongs here in a way she never will. The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. My whole life I had believed my father barely noticed me, that Mira was the one who mattered, the one they were proud of. Yet here was proof in his own hand that he had seen me. He had understood me in ways I never imagined. I flipped further, my fingers shaking. Another entry stood out, the ink pressed deeper as though written with unusual force. Daniel thinks he is forgotten, but he is not. You were not forgotten. You were chosen. I read the line again and again, the words striking harder with every repetition. For years I had carried the weight of invisibility, convinced I was an afterthought. Now, staring at my father's handwriting, I realized the truth was the opposite. I wasn't overlooked. I was entrusted. A sob tore from my throat before I could stop it. I pressed the journal against my chest, shoulders shaking as decades of anger cracked apart inside me. For the first time since the reading of the will, I cried not from humiliation but from recognition. My father had seen me, truly seen me. The journal slipped from my lap onto the floor, open to another passage. I leaned down and read through blurry eyes. Wealth fades. Houses crumble, but land endures. I cannot give Daniel the world of money and politics. That world would break him. Instead, I give him what lasts. The land will be his strength, his refuge, his legacy. I sat, frozen tears streaking my face as the storm howled outside. All the years of bitterness of comparing myself to Mira's wealth and success suddenly shifted. The mansion and millions weren't signs of favoritism. They were distractions, burdens Mira could handle, but I could not. What I had been given was different, quieter, but infinitely more powerful. My hands shook as I gathered more journals, scanning entry after entry. They were filled not only with deeds and maps, but with memories. He had written about the time I built a treehouse, about my first fishing catch, about the way I laughed when sparks flew from the campfire. He remembered everything. For years I had thought he clapped politely and forgot, but he had carried those moments into ink, preserving them forever. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. Yet within that weight was something new, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of responsibility. My humiliation had begun to transform into something else. I closed my eyes, hearing his voice in the storm, whispering the same words from the journal. You were chosen. I opened them again, staring at the open chest, the maps, the journals spilling across the floor. If this was true, if the land was mine, then everything I thought I knew about my family had changed. But a question burned hotter than the fire I had once planned to set. Why had my father kept this hidden? Why bury the truth beneath the snow instead of speaking it aloud? As I sat in that broken cabin, tears drying on my face, I realized the answers might not be comforting. Some truths carry their own shadows, and I would have to face them. The journals lay scattered across the cabin floor when I noticed a bundle wrapped tighter than the rest, bound in oilcloth and sealed with wax. My hands, still trembling, pulled it free. Inside were folders, maps, and official-looking envelopes stamped with county seals. I opened the first document and my breath caught. It was a deed. My name, Daniel Holt, written in bold print, sealed and notarized. I fumbled for the next folder, then another, each one marking another parcel of land. Together they formed a patchwork of thousands of acres surrounding the cabin. My father hadn't just imagined this legacy, he had secured it legally, deliberately, piece by piece. I spread the maps across the dusty floor, tracing the boundaries with my finger. The land stretched far beyond anything I had ever walked as a boy. Hills, rivers, forests, entire valleys now carried my name. For a moment, the weight of it left me dizzy. And then the realization hit. This wasn't just wilderness, it was wealth. I thought of Mira's mansion in Los Angeles, her $5.7 million inheritance, that had seemed so untouchable. But the sheer size of this estate, the untouched value of thousands of acres, could eclipse it. In the market in time, it might be worth twice as much, maybe more. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. The cruel insult, the rotten shack, had hidden something greater than Mira's polished estate. My father had handed me power beyond her imagination. But as I shuffled through the papers, a single envelope marked addendum slid free. I tore it open, expecting more deeds, but instead found a page of instructions written in my father's firm hand. "Daniel," it began, "if you are reading this, then the land is yours. But know this, it cannot be sold, it cannot be divided. It must remain whole as it was meant to be. This land is not for profit, it is for you to protect. That is my will." I froze, staring at the words. A sharp sting of frustration coursed through me. After all this, after discovering my inheritance was more valuable than Mira's here, was a restriction tighter than chains. I couldn't sell, couldn't cash in, couldn't turn my victory into money. The temptation of revenge flashed in my mind. How satisfying it would be to march into Mira's mansion and announce that my land was worth more than her millions, then sell it piece by piece just to prove it. But my father had foreseen that urge. He had barred me from it. I clenched the paper in my fists, torn between rage and awe. My father hadn't simply given me wealth, he had handed me a duty. He hadn't trusted Mira with it, only me. For years I had believed myself the forgotten son, the afterthought. But this addendum told me otherwise. He had chosen me because I could be trusted not to squander it, not to sell it to the highest bidder. He had chosen me to protect something larger than money. I sat back on the cold floor, the weight of the papers pressing on my lap. The storm outside rattled the windows as if echoing my father's demand. Keep it whole. Guard it. That was my true inheritance, not just acres of land, but the responsibility to preserve it. Tears burned in my eyes again, but this time they mixed with something harder, steelier. My humiliation was not only turning into victory, but into a mission. Mira could have her mansion, her polished parties, her money. I had been given something that could not be bought, a trust. Yet even as that pride stirred, so did the tension. If this land was mine, and if its value was so immense, what would happen when Mira discovered it? What lengths would she go to once she realized the brother she had mocked now held the greater inheritance? The thought chilled me more than the storm ever could. The storm outside had not eased, but inside the cabin I felt something shift. The weight of my father's restrictions still pressed on me. Yet beneath it all, another feeling stirred, something softer, older, almost forgotten. My eyes drifted back to the journals scattered on the floor. One had fallen open to a page with a photograph taped inside. It was me, maybe 6 years old, sitting on the porch of this very cabin with a fishing pole far too big for my hands. My father had written beneath it in his slanted hand, "Daniel at his happiest." I traced the words with my fingertip and memories unspooled like film. I saw myself running through these woods with scraped knees, chasing fireflies until my mother called me in for supper. I smelled her cooking again, the aroma of cornbread and stew filling the air as she hummed by the stove. I remembered the warmth of the fireplace, the crackle of burning logs, while my father told stories about the land and his own childhood. For years I had buried these memories under layers of resentment, convinced they didn't matter because they weren't celebrated with trophies or applause. But now, with the journals before me, I realized they had mattered all along. My father had noticed. My mother had cherished. Their love hadn't been loud, but it had been steady. I turned another page. There, in a quiet entry written in winter ink, my father had recorded Daniel spent 3 hours building a fire today. He refused my help. When it finally caught, his face lit up like the sun. Alma said she hadn't seen him that proud in years. My throat tightened. He had remembered. Every small moment I thought had slipped away into nothingness was here preserved. I wasn't invisible. I had never been invisible. Another entry spoke of Mira. She thrives in the city in the spotlight. Daniel thrives here in silence. Each child has their gift. Alma and I must love them as they are, not as the world demands. The words pierced deeper than any Inuit Mira had ever thrown at me. For the first time I understood their love had never been unequal. It had been different. She had been given wealth and walls of marble because that was her world. I had been given these woods, these skies, because they were mine. Tears welled again, but this time without bitterness. The rage that had driven me north through snow and storm began to loosen its grip. I had wanted revenge to burn the cabin and erase the insult. But the truth was here in ink and memory. There had never been an insult, only a trust I hadn't recognized. I pressed the journal shut and leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. The wind howled outside, but within me the storm quieted. I thought of the can of gasoline still by the door. Hours ago it had been my weapon, my answer. Now it felt like a relic from another life, one I no longer wished to carry. For the first time I saw the cabin not as a burden but as a home again. Not just a shell of rotting wood, but the keeper of my family's story. My humiliation was dissolving, replaced by something steadier, heavier, a sense of belonging. Yet as I sat there, a new thought crept in. If I had been wrong about my parents, what else might I be wrong about? What did Mira know or not know? Had she seen this side of them? Or was she still blind, clinging to marble halls and money? The question gnawed at me. If she discovered the truth of this land, would she accept it, or would she fight me for it? The question of Mira gnawed at me all night, and I barely slept. By morning the storm had cleared, leaving the woods silent under a sky sharp with winter light. I stoked the fire and tried to read more of my father's journals. But every word circled back to her. If she knew about this land, she wouldn't ignore it. Mira never ignored power. By noon I heard the crunch of tires on frozen gravel. My chest tightened. A sleek black SUV pulled up outside the cabin, its glossy paint a jarring contrast to the snow and rough logs. The driver's door opened and Mira stepped out, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, her heels sinking awkwardly into the snow. Behind her, a man in a tailored suit emerged, clutching a leather briefcase. She walked toward the cabin like it was hers already. "Daniel." She called, her voice smooth and practiced. "I thought I'd come check on you. Make sure you're adjusting." I stood in the doorway, blocking her path. "What do you want, Mira?" She smiled, but her eyes flicked past me, scanning the cabin's dark interior. "Relax. I brought someone with me. This is Mr. Collins. He's in real estate. A very good friend. He's looked over the property records. I think you've got something here, but let's be honest. You're not equipped to deal with it." The man stepped forward, offering a polished handshake I didn't take. "Mr. Holt, I represent buyers who would pay very generously. We could make this simple. Quick cash, no hassle." Mira tilted her head, that same condescending look she'd worn in the lawyer's office. $5 million. Cash. Think about it, Daniel. You could walk away from this drafty shack, buy a real home, finally live like a man instead of a hermit. It's more than you've ever had in your life. Her words stung, not because they were true, but because once I might have agreed. Once I might have leapt at the chance to turn my humiliation into money. But not now. Not after the journals. Not after the truth. I turned back into the cabin, heart pounding, and pulled the stack of deeds and my father's addendum from the table. The papers felt heavier than iron in my hands. When I stepped back outside, Mira's smug expression faltered. "These," I said, holding them up, "prove the land is mine. Not just the cabin, the thousands of acres surrounding it, legally signed over years ago." I shoved the addendum toward her. "And this is our father's will. His real will. He chose me. He trusted me, not you." For the first time in my life, I watched Mira lose her composure. Her smile cracked, her eyes darted across the pages, searching for some loophole, some angle of denial. Her hand trembled as she held the documents. That can't be right," she whispered. But the color draining from her face betrayed the truth. The realtor leaned closer to her, murmuring, "It's airtight. These are valid. There's nothing we can contest." I saw it then, the flash of rage in her eyes, quickly smothered under years of practiced control. But it was too late. I had seen it. She had lost. "You thought you could buy me out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You thought I was still the fool sitting quietly in the lawyer's office. But you were wrong. This land is worth more than your mansion, more than your millions. And you can't touch it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She simply stood there, papers clutched in her manicured hands, the winter wind tugging at her coat. For the first time, it was Mira who looked small. But even as I savored the moment, a shadow passed through me. Mira had never accepted defeat easily, and the fire in her eyes told me this was far from over. The memory of Mira's stunned silence in the cabin lingered with me, but I should have known better than to believe it was over. My sister had never been one to accept defeat, especially when money and pride were on the line. Weeks later, I received a letter summoning me to a county courthouse in Montana. Mira had hired one of the sharpest attorneys in Los Angeles and was challenging the will itself. Her smile that day in the lawyer's office replayed in my head, but this time it wasn't smug, it was dangerous. She wanted revenge, and she had the money to buy it. The courthouse was small, its wooden benches filled with curious locals who had heard whispers of a family fortune being contested. To them, I was the handyman's son who had inherited a cabin, and Mira was the glamorous sister from California. The contrast between us was almost theatrical, and I could feel the eyes of every stranger burning into my back as I walked to my seat. Mira sat across the aisle, her lawyer in a polished suit whispering into her ear. She didn't even glance at me. That was her way, pretend I didn't exist until it was time to crush me. Her lawyer opened with venom wrapped in silk. He painted me as ungrateful, unstable, even dangerous. He claimed I had fabricated documents, forged papers to steal land that was never meant for me. Then came the so-called evidence photocopies of letters supposedly signed by my father stating that the Montana property was to remain in the family trust, not in my hands. The crowd murmured, and for a moment I felt the old humiliation rising in my chest, that familiar sense of being the lesser son, the forgotten one. But I wasn't the boy who once cowered in my sister's shadow anymore. When the judge asked for my response, I rose and placed my father's leather-bound journals on the table. They weren't just words, they were his voice, his heart, his truth. And within those pages was something no forgery could touch, fingerprints faint but clear, preserved in ink smudges and the oils of his hands. My attorney pointed them out, each mark a silent testimony that this was no fake. This was my father's legacy written in his own hand. The tension in the room grew heavy as the journals were passed to the judge. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of pages turning. I saw the judge's eyes linger on passages where my father wrote about me by name, about the land, about trust. You were not forgotten, you were chosen. The words leapt from the page even now, years after they had been written, and I saw the judge's stern expression soften ever so slightly. Mira's attorney tried to object, raising his voice, insisting the journals were sentimental but not legal. That's when I pulled out the final blow, the notarized deed bearing my name and the date my father had transferred ownership. It wasn't just paper, it was ironclad law. My father had prepared for this moment, anticipating the greed and conflict that might come after he was gone. He had given me not just the land, but the proof to defend it. The judge set the documents down and looked at Mira. For the first time, I saw her mask falter. The same sister who once smirked as I sat humiliated now sat pale, her hand gripping the table as if it could anchor her. The judge's gavel struck sharp and final. The will stands as written. The land and all its holdings belong to Daniel Holt. A wave of relief washed over me, but it wasn't just relief, it was vindication. The boy who was once overlooked had just beaten the golden child at her own game. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some sympathetic to Mira, others nodding toward me as if justice had been served. But even as the judgment was read, Mira's eyes met mine, blazing with a fury that told me this wasn't the end. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering words I couldn't hear. But the look she gave me was enough. She had lost the legal battle, but I knew my sister well enough to understand. She was already plotting her next move. And as I stepped out into the cold Montana air, the victory still warm in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that this fight had only opened another door. The land was safe for now, but blood ties and greed had a way of twisting back on themselves. What was Mira planning next? The courthouse battle had ended, the gavel striking in my favor, yet the victory felt incomplete. I carried the weight of every insult, every dismissal, every time I had been overlooked. The land was mine, the law had spoken, but the bitterness still clung to me like smoke in my lungs. Mira's glare haunted me even in sleep, but it was not her shadow I needed to escape, it was my own anger. I returned to the cabin, and for the first time I looked at it not as a punishment, not as an insult, but as the foundation of everything my father had left me. The place was still crumbling, the roof sagging under years of snow, the walls scarred by storms. But instead of gasoline, I brought nails and timber. Each day I worked, I patched holes, replaced steps, sealed cracks. The cabin had once felt like a cage, a reminder of all I lacked. Now, with every hammer strike, it became something else. It became mine. The echoes of my childhood filled the air, laughter by the fire, my father's voice teaching me how to split wood, my mother humming as she stirred a pot on the old stove. What had once been ghosts now felt like blessings. One evening, after days of labor, I sat by the fireplace with the first letter my father had left me, the letter that had stopped me from burning this place down, the one that had changed the course of everything. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged by my own hands, but the words still burned as fiercely as the night I found them. I realized that clinging to this letter meant clinging to the anger that had carried me here. It was time to let go. I lit the fire in the hearth flames, dancing bright against the stone. I held the letter above the heat, my hands trembling not with rage but with release. As the paper curled and blackened, I whispered a prayer I didn't know I had inside me, a goodbye to the resentment that had defined me for too long. Watching the ashes fall, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I had burned away not my inheritance, but the bitterness poisoning it. Then I reached for the gasoline can. The same can I had carried with the intent to destroy everything. This time I opened it and poured it slowly into the flames, not with vengeance, but with purpose. The fire roared, filling the room with light and heat. I watched as the blaze consumed the remnants of my past rage, and I whispered the words that had waited inside me all along. The fire I needed wasn't to destroy, it was to rebuild. The heat washed over me, and for the first time I didn't see flames as destruction, but as rebirth. The cabin glowed with the reflection of that fire, and I knew it was no longer a shack of humiliation, but the heart of something new. It was no longer the symbol of what I had been denied, but of what I had been entrusted with. Yet even as I sat there watching the fire crackle, I felt the world beyond these woods pressing in. Mira was still out there, humiliated and furious. She had money, influence, and a grudge as deep as my own once was. I had chosen to rebuild, but what would she choose? The thought lingered like a shadow across the flames, a reminder that peace was never simple, not in families like ours. The flames in the hearth had burned low, leaving only a bed of glowing embers, yet I sat there long after the fire had quieted. The cabin, once a symbol of shame, now felt alive, filled with the echoes of my father's presence. I thought of Mira pacing in her mansion, surrounded by marble floors and chandeliers, yet restless, furious, and hollow. She had inherited money, but I had inherited meaning. The difference weighed on me like a revelation. The land stretched endlessly outside my window, thousands of acres my father had gathered piece by piece, not for profit, but for preservation. It wasn't a mere fortune, it was a trust, a responsibility, a gift that no stock portfolio or mansion could. For years I had believed myself a forgotten child, but now I understood I had been chosen for something far greater. My father had seen who I truly was, and he had entrusted me with what mattered most to him. That knowledge didn't just heal the wound of neglect, it transformed it into pride. I walked outside into the cold night. The sky above Montana was heavy with stars, the kind of sky you could never see in Los Angeles. I breathed in the crisp air, felt the earth firm beneath my boots, and for the first time I didn't feel small or lesser. I felt rooted like one of the towering pines that lined the ridge. I whispered the words to the night, words that carried both defiance and peace. Inheritance isn't always money. Sometimes it's destiny. The weight of those words sank into me as I gazed across the forest. Every tree, every frozen stream, every stretch of unbroken wilderness was part of the legacy my father had left. It wasn't a cage to hold me, it was a kingdom to guard. And unlike Mira, who saw wealth only as a crown to wear, I saw it as a burden to carry with dignity. That difference was what set us apart, and what gave me a future she could never buy. I thought back to the gasoline can once meant for destruction, now emptied into the fire of renewal. My life had followed the same path. I had been ready to burn everything in rage, but instead I had built something stronger out of the ashes. Revenge had once driven me, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was the trust of a father who, in his silence, had loved me more deeply than I ever knew. The cabin behind me glowed faintly with firelight, repaired and steady, no longer a ruin, but a home. The forest before me stretched wide and unending, a world untouched, waiting. I stood there with the quiet certainty that while Mira had won her millions, I had won something greater: peace, purpose, and a destiny only I could fulfill. And as the night wrapped around me, I knew that whatever battles still lay ahead, I was no longer the forgotten son, I was the chosen one. So that was my story, the story of how I thought I was left with nothing but humiliation, only to discover that my true inheritance was far greater than money. I carried anger for so many years, but in the end I found peace, purpose, and a legacy I was meant to protect. If my story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss more stories like this. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever felt overlooked or underestimated, only to find out later that life had something else in store for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts, because sometimes the most powerful truths come from the struggles we all share.